Nu we zullen herjan, he Phonological word, methodes michte, and his moordathonk. Weork wulderfarer, zwa he wundra je was, eetje drichten, ord onstelde. He erst je shop, than Bernum, he van der Hofe, hali schippend, da midanjaard, monkunes wert, eetje drichten after Theode, firmfolden, freya allmächtig. That is Old English. This is what we will be encountering today and next week as well in the next lecture. I won't go into any of the detail right now, other than this is a hymn. This is a hymn supposedly composed by a monk called Cadman. The story of this guy goes that he was a monk who was responsible for looking after the animals. And unlike all of the other monks, he could not sing or write poetry. And one day, someone came to him and said, Cadman, you have a go, you write a hymn. And apparently, completely off the cuff, he came up with this. And everyone was so impressed that they then they thought this must be a miracle. God has reached into his mind and given him poetry. But this is just one of the texts that we find in Old English. There are many, and these sources will be one of the topics that we talk about today. This text has a particular property of being a very early text, actually, and therefore might reveal some of the very earliest features of Old English. But this version of it is actually much, much later. The text itself is thought to have been composed in the very early part, 6th or 7th century, and this West Saxon version is 300 or 400 years later. So there is quite a gap there. But we do have other versions of this text, which we will talk a little bit about. So today we're going to talk about Old English. We've got 2 lectures on Old English, because Old English is hard. And we're going to talk first today about essentially the phonetics, the phonology, and the morphology of the language. Next week, we'll come on to the syntax, the lexicon, and the dialectal variation that we find in the language. Today, we're focusing on, first, the sources and the spelling. So how do we know about Old English? Remember that I said we can't just take it as given that we know all about this language. We have to think about where the texts come from and why we have them. We need to talk about the sounds of the language, so how the sounds were set up, both from the point of view of phonetics, how they were concretely pronounced, insofar as we have access to that at all, and from the perspective of phonology, which of these sounds were contrastive, which of these sounds were part of the sound system of Old English. And then we're going to talk about the morphology, and we'll spend quite some time on that, because the morphology of Old English is probably the way in which it differs the most from English of today. Just a quick reminder on a practical note, the tutorials, as usual, are today. The room has been changed, so the new room is R0513. And it would be good, if you are in the first of these 2 tutorials, to possibly go to the second one instead, to balance out the numbers. You might get more personalized service in that later group. And just a quick note from me, because I'm away tomorrow, there will be no Sprechstunde for me. So if you want to come and see me, make an appointment, or you can come on Wednesday. Does anyone have any questions? Good, okay, so let's begin. Where did we get to? Well, in the first half of the 5th century, we saw the Angles, the Saxons, the Frisians, and the Jutes arriving in England and settling there. They start to settle there. It's a slow process. They don't settle in great numbers immediately. According to some accounts, they don't settle in great numbers at all. But whatever the case may be, from the 6th century onwards, the language that we find in the area that is now England is English, Old English specifically, the Germanic language that is spoken by these tribes. And this term, derived from the word for the Angles, is the word that the people themselves use to describe the language that they are speaking. Now, the earliest Old English was written in runes, not in the not in the Latin alphabet, but in runes. And Old English has its own runic alphabet called the Futhark, and this is slightly different from the Futhark that we saw last week, or rather that we didn't see last week because it came out as a bunch of white boxes and Arabic characters. But this Futhark is the Anglo-Saxon development of that runic alphabet, and we're not going to talk any further about it today, except in passing. If you want to find out more about the runes, because they are really rather nice, then you should look at this book by Page from 1999, An Introduction to Old English Runes, which is given in the references. So how do we know about Old English? What do we have? We've got various sources. This one here is the front of one of our most beautiful Old English manuscripts, the Lindisfarne Gospels. So we talk about Old English usually as a fairly homogeneous entity because actually that's what the texts that are transmitted lead us to think. I've mentioned, I think, King Alfred, Alfred the Great, before. He was King of Wessex. He played a pivotal role in defeating the Vikings, or at least driving them off for a while, establishing the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. He was rated, I think, 15th recently in a poll of the greatest Britons of all time, which is kind of ironic because he was not himself a Briton. He was an Anglo-Saxon, and the Britons were the people who were there before. But this is early Old English, and most of the early Old English that we have comes from the second half of the 9th century, because Alfred initiated a program of writing in the vernacular, where previously people would have been writing in Latin. Alfred was insistent that people should be writing in English, in Old English. And so we can divide the Old English period up before and after 900. After 900, we have a lot of Old English, especially the best known of these writers is an abbot, Abbot Alfrich of Incham, and he wrote a tremendous amount. He wrote homilies, he wrote sermons, he wrote saints' lives. He is he is the single most prolific writer in the Old English period, and so you'll come across his name quite a lot. Both of these were writing in the West Saxon dialect, the dialect of Wessex, and that is what we mostly talk about when we talk about Old English. From now on, in fact, West Saxon and Old English are more or less going to be used synonymously in this course. We're going to come back to the question of dialectal variation towards the end of next week's lecture. But if you want to have an idea of roughly how much we have of Old English, we're talking about 3 million words. It's about maybe 3.3 million words in total surviving from this period. That's not an awful lot. It's a lot more than for some languages that we don't have native speakers of, but it's still not an awful lot, especially if we're trying to draw conclusions about things like text type, pragmatics, syntax, rare syntactic phenomena. It's not all that clear whether we actually can make good generalizations based on just this kind of data. Okay, so what major works are there in Old English? Well, Old English is not only interesting from a linguistic point of view, some of the texts in Old English are also very interesting from a historical point of view or from a literary point of view. The Jewel in the Crown is probably Beowulf, which you may have heard of. There have been many adaptations of Beowulf, many translations, and film versions and so on. Beowulf is a poetic text, and it's the most famous of the Old English texts that still remain. It's also usually considered to be a very early text. And we're not going to use that many examples from Beowulf in this course for the simple reason that its combination of poetry, dialect, and early date makes it very hard to read. We're going to focus on slightly easier bits of Old English for the most part. But Beowulf is a phenomenally interesting text, and if you follow this course through and engage with the other texts, you should be able to start making some sense of Beowulf if you're interested in engaging with it for literary purposes. Beowulf is preserved in one manuscript, which is, again, it's later than the text. This is often the case. The manuscripts that we have of Old English texts are much later than the texts that they're supposed to represent. And that's important because it means that we need to be a little bit skeptical about these texts. It means that we need to think, are they really representing features of, let's say, 7th century Old English, or are they representing texts from 10th century Old English? 4 centuries can make an awful lot of difference. So then we have the Lindisfarne Gospels. That's the text that I showed you on the previous slide, or the pre-previous slide. So this is this beautiful text here. This is a text that was produced in the Northumbrian region. It's one of the few texts that we have that are clearly from the Northumbrian dialect. And you can see that the way this text works, actually most of the text the main text is in Latin, but someone has added a gloss for Old English readers to be able to read it. So you see here, incipit begins, and that's translated in Old English, onyinet. So you've got the Old English word in a smaller text above the Latin. So this is an interesting text for that reason. It's basically a very, very close translation of the original Latin gospel text. Then we've got the Junius manuscript. This contains all kinds of great texts. It includes some poetic texts, various dates, again 7th to the 10th centuries. We've got the Exeter book, which is particularly nice because it contains riddles. A lot of the texts that we have, in fact, all of these texts would have been written by monks in a religious context, but not all of them are religious in nature. Particularly these riddles, some of them are decidedly unreligious. And so you can get the impression that what these monks were doing with these riddles was having a little bit of fun. Those are fun texts to look at. And this very interesting poem, Wolf and Edwacher. And then finally we have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which basically it's like a calendar. It has a diary entry for every year or every other year or every few years, and it tells you what's happened in that year. So it'll say things like, in this year, King such and such died and his body is to be found at such and such a place. So that text is extremely interesting from a historical perspective, less so from a literary perspective, though they also don't hesitate to embellish things occasionally. So, for instance, there is a reference in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to dragons, which presumably were not in fact found in England of the period, though we can't be sure. So, this is what these texts look like. Here we've got the one that you've seen, the Lindisfarne Gospels. Over here you've got a lovely illustration from the Junius manuscript. Here we've got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. You can see it's written quite compactly. You've got a year here written in Latin numerals. Text here from the Exeter book. And up here we've got the very famous start of Beowulf. And this is what the manuscripts look like. It's important to remember what these manuscripts look like, because when we see these texts, we will be mostly working with them in printed form, in typed up printed form. But the actual physical objects can not only be things of great beauty, but can also reveal things about the language, about the structure of the language, and about the use of the language that we might not necessarily suspect if we only look at the printed versions. So these are the major texts from the Old English period, or some of them at least, and there are many that I haven't mentioned. 3 million words is enough to have a reasonable diversity. There are many things that we're lacking, of course. We don't have anything that's obviously written by anyone other than clergy. We don't have texts written by women, for a start. That's half the population. So we've got a fairly limited selection of texts, but not so limited as to be unable to draw conclusions. And when you look at these manuscripts, you've probably already noticed a few things. And when you look at the text that I provided right at the very start, you probably noticed a few things. And these texts, we've moved on from the runic here. We're using the Roman alphabet. This just came over with the Roman Empire, with Christianity, essentially via Ireland, because Ireland had a strong tradition of monasteries and monks, and a special script was developed in this area, Insula Minuscule. Insula Minuscule looks like this. It has, unlike some of the other scripts of the time, it has ascenders and descenders, so the f goes below the line here, the d goes above the line, the h goes above the line, this thing goes above and below the line. So this is the Insula Minuscule, and it's mostly the Roman alphabet, the Latin alphabet, with which you will be familiar, but it has a few extra things that you might not be familiar with. So for a start, you've got this. This you get in both uppercase and lowercase versions. This is an uppercase version. It's called ash. And basically what it is an A and an E that have been jammed together. They've been written as a single word. Technical term, ligated digraph, single character, rather. So that's ash, and that you see all over the place. And then we also see a symbol called thorn. Now, this you see in various positions. Here's one at the beginning of the line. This is, again, this symbol that goes both above and below the line. You've got one here as well. And down here, this thorn symbol is a retention from the runic alphabet. So this actually does come from the Futhorc. This doesn't. This is just an A and an E written together. Sometimes I get people writing on exam scripts that it comes from the runic alphabet. No. This is just an A and an E that have gone together. But the thorn is something that you find in this Germanic tradition. And it represents a sound that would be, depending on the context, th or the, which you'll notice is not a sound that the Latin alphabet actually has a particular symbol for dealing with. And in modern English spelling, we use a T and an H together for the sound th or the. But that's actually not very satisfactory when you think about it, because the sound th or the is not a combination of a T and an H. You don't say t, or anything like that. Right? It's a th or a the. It's a different sound, and it ought to have its own symbol, but the Latin alphabet doesn't allow it to have one. Another symbol that's used to represent the same sound, and these two symbols are used more or less interchangeably. There is some research on where people use one or the other, but in general they can represent the same sounds depending on the text and depending on the author. We've got this one which is called an ev, and the ev is basically a D, a curly D with a bar through it. So we've got a big one here, tha. Tha, in fact, tha, hu tha, and this tha, this th, it's the same sound as is represented by the thorn, but it's a different way of representing it. It's a D with a bar through it. That's called the ev. That also is not from runic. That's just a D with a bar through it. Then you've got a yog. This yog symbol, when we don't ever see it printed in the Old English texts, because it's just the usual way in this Irish Insula Minuscule script of writing a G. So there's no point rendering it specially. In Middle English, it starts to have a different role. So we're going to come back to this yog. But for now, we can just talk about it in terms of a G. But it doesn't always represent a G in pronunciation. In fact, it can represent various things. I put on the slide mostly y. It's mostly a y, in fact, but it can also be various other things. It can be a g, it can be a h. And when we talk about the sound system of Old English, we'll talk more about that. Finally, the only other thing that comes from the runic system is this, which is a win rune. And the win, it represents a W, and you have to be careful not to be caught out by it because it looks like a P. If you see here, it's a W sound, but it looks like a P, a long sort of P that's a little bit narrow at the bottom. You can see it goes down, sort of pear-shaped. But it represents this W sound. And again, in the additions, it's usually represented as simply a W because it's always the same thing, and it doesn't need to be represented any differently in the texts. This symbol hasn't come out right, but it should be a 7, or look like a 7. And that is a symbol that is called a Tironian et. We don't find any examples here, but it stands for and, basically. It's just a shorthand form of the word and. If we go back to the other manuscripts here, we ought to be able to find one somewhere. Yeah. There are some little ones in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has a lot of ands. It goes and, and here we find this symbol. It's sort of a right angle, little thing, and there's one there and one there. And you get all of these little sort of weird 7-like right angle symbols. It's called a Tironian et. It's just shorthand for the word and. And the other way of doing shorthand for a word and is one that we find in modern English as well, which is the ampersand, this curly thing. And all of those we find in the Old English alphabet. But for the most part, the Old English alphabet is not all that alien to us. It contains a lot of the symbols that we expect from the present day. It contains a couple from the runic alphabet that we've since lost, like thorn and win. And it contains a few other little oddities like the ash, like the yog. But most of the time, it's not actually that difficult to transliterate what these texts are saying into something that will be more familiar to you. So as I've said, these symbols are from the runic Futhorc alphabet. This yog, as it becomes a separate letter type in Middle English, these two, the ash and the eth, just develop naturally. Actually, the ash comes from the continental Roman tradition of writing. The eth, it was developed, or at least it isn't found in the very earliest texts of Old English. We find more of it later on. And these two, these and symbols, go back to our earlier Latin scripts. So any questions about the spelling? Obviously, that's the first challenge when you get an Old English text put in front of you, but it's not too terrifying. It's not like Cyrillic or Chinese or anything like that. This is an alphabet that is basically our alphabet, but with a few little oddities in it. Sounds, then. What sounds did Old English have? We can be fairly certain that it didn't have the same sounds as today. We have to think with a language like Old English how we would ever know anything about the sounds. We obviously can't go back and listen to them. We have to make certain assumptions based on how things are pronounced today, how things were pronounced at the time. That latter part we can try and infer based on comparative languages where we do know the pronunciation. We can use the comparative method that we talked about last time in order to try and figure out what Old English actually sounded like. So for the most part, Today I'm just going to be assuming that we know what it sounds like, but you should be skeptical. There are some things that we're not really all that sure about. So here, for instance, here we've got the full picture. This is the Old English sound system. Hopefully you should recognize this kind of representation. This is just a vowel quadrilateral. These are the vowels that were distinctive in Old English. One of the important things to note about Old English is that it has long vowels and it has short vowels. And so length is distinct. Length is phonemic in Old English, in fact. There are minimal pairs that are distinguished only by length. So, for instance, the word God is distinguished from the word god, meaning good. The only distinction is, in modern English they're similar, but the quality of the vowel distinguishes them, versus o. In Old English, there is no quality distinction, at least we assume there was no quality distinction. There is simply a length distinction, god versus god. So these vowels, these are the ones that are found. You can see a lot of them are not going to be that unfamiliar to you either. So a, e, o, u, a. This is a very Germanic sound system. It has more in common with German than it does with present-day English. It also has two vowels at the top of the front, an E and a rounded version. You round the lips to pronounce this one, U, which is a U with umlaut in German. So we've got E and we've got U. Also sound that you find in many Western European languages, French included. So that's the vowel system. And there are also some diphthongs, which are strings of basically two sounds, usually a glide and a vowel, or just two vowels that sort of fade into one another. These are our diphthongs, and they look like this. Then at the bottom of the table, or the bottom of the slide, we've got a table with all of the consonants. And again, not too many surprises, I would hope. So we've got pers, bers, fers, vers, ters, ders, sers, zers, kers, gers. What we also have is these things down here. But again, as German speakers, these are probably not going to be too unfamiliar to you, because this one at least, this one written with a chi symbol, is a h sound, as in nach, right? Or noch. It's that h. We still have that in present-day English, but only very marginally in certain words, like a loch, a Scottish lake. And in fact, a lot of English speakers will pronounce that lock. This sound is simply the voiced counterpart. So if you try and produce the sound at the end of loch or nach and produce it with voicing, then that's what comes out. Dutch has this sound. And it's one of the reasons that Dutch people sound like they have throat problems. So that's the remaining fricative. We've got a string of nasals, just the ones we have in modern English, basically n, and ng. And then we've got liquids, l and I won't go into the exact phonetic details of this but it probably wasn't the same. It almost certainly wasn't the same as the one that we have in English today, or the many that we have in English today, in fact. It's a complex sound. And then we have two glides, a w and a y, both of which we find quite robustly in Old English. And one final thing to mention is this h, which is a real h, a real glottal sound. Now, not all sounds occur in all positions here. Fricatives, for instance, they only occur voiced when they themselves are between voiced sounds. I'll come back to an example of that in a minute, but the crucial notion here if you remember your phonology from Shi 1, is that the voicing in fricatives is not a phonemic distinction. Fricatives are voiced when they are between voiced sounds, elsewhere they are voiceless. That means they're in complementary distribution. They're allophones of the same phoneme. So that particular sound is not phonemic. That particular distinction is not a meaningful one, not a phoneme-carrying distinction in the Old English language. And they're written the same, which can be confusing. So when you look at the texts, the Old English alphabet doesn't make use of this symbol, at least not for the same thing. Right? This is not a symbol for a voiced labiodental fricative. This is a symbol. This symbol here, this f symbol, is used for both the voiced variant and the voiceless variant. And this actually reflects a fairly basic principle in how writing systems are constructed, which is that writing systems on the whole tend to be phonemic and not phonetic. They tend to represent not all of the variants of the sound that a language makes, but rather the variants of a sound that are meaningful units, that are meaning-bearing units, phonemes in the language. So we'll come back to some examples. But the other thing to note about Old English sounds is that they were changing. They didn't stay constant throughout the Old English period. And that shouldn't be surprising either, because no language stays the same for long, unless it's a dead language or an artificial language. And when we're talking about the Old English period, we're talking about a period of 700 years, 450 to 1150. And even if we only have records for the last 500 of that, it's still true that we would expect to see variation during that period. We would expect the language to change, and indeed it does. So we'll talk about a few different sound changes. The ones that need the most focus are palatalization, breaking, and I-umlaut. But there are also little ones, and these ones, some of them can be illustrated by reference to things that happen in modern English. So, for instance, a common process in Old English was to simply delete certain sounds in certain positions. This is what happens, for instance, in a word. If we talk about, if we divide up a pie into 5 pieces, we are dividing it up into fifths, right? With 3 voiceless fricatives at the end. But in fact, the way most people usually pronounce that, they would say something like, we're dividing it up into fifths, and lose the second f entirely. So you get rid of that second f. So that's something that we see, fifths, in modern English, and these deletion processes occur sporadically in Old English too. We also see, and this is very interesting, metathesis. Metathesis is where 2 sounds swap places. So in Old English, we have the word Ross, which is cognate with the German word Ross for a certain type of horse. That becomes horse. The O and the R swap places, right? This O and this R swap round. Similarly, in the word weps, a wasp, the S and the P become switched over, so you get a wasp rather than a waps. Okay? So this is a common process. Another one that we saw in the very first lecture, was the word bird. The word bird, which in Old English and even Middle English texts we see as brid, with the R before the I. So metathesis is a common process in Old English, and in fact throughout the history of English. And then finally we also see insertion sometimes. There are varieties of English too that do this today. So in a word like milk, sometimes you'll get people pronouncing it with an extra vowel in it. They'll say something like milk. And in a word like nuclear, as in nuclear power, you get people say things like nuclear, right? with an extra vowel after the k. So these sound changes, these sound changes, actually all of them represent processes that are quite common across the world's languages, many of which we can recognize going on in English today around us in certain varieties. But the Old English effects are fairly predictable, except that they're not always completely regular. Certainly a change like metathesis doesn't obey the principle of regularity of sound change that we discussed last week. So of these three sound changes, the big ones, we ought to talk about palatalization first, because palatalization leads you sometimes to mispronounce things in Old English texts. So here we have sk, k, and g being fronted to sh, ch, and sh. So these sounds become fronted, and therefore the pronunciation ends up being different from the way it looks. And this is true in the Old English period as well. So the context, this is a conditioned sound change. It happens when you've got these vowels, the I, the E, the A, or the Y, in front of, when you've got those after the consonant, or if you've got the consonant at the end of the word and one of these sounds before it, the change also happens. And what it does is it basically, like I say, it fronts the sounds and it fricates them or lenites them in general. So here we've got sk and sh. So for instance here, this word, the Old English word, which is written with an SC at the beginning, is pronounced ship. Even though it's written what you might think of as skip, it's pronounced ship. So this SC sound, this SC combination in Old English almost always represents the sh sound. And this is retained in modern English, except that the modern English has the H written in. Again, this is actually not a s and a h, right? SH, we don't call this thing a ship, right? That's what it would be if it was an S and an H, but this SH together stands for the sound sh. And there are some Germanic languages even now that don't have this change. So all of the Scandinavian languages have skip, or some word like it, with a k. Gothic, which I've mentioned before, has a k. So this is a change that happens in some of the West Germanic languages. Similarly, this k becomes a ch. And this, for instance, this illustrates words like this. Old English, this word is not pronounced dick, it is pronounced ditch, with a ch sound at the end. So this is not the same, recall. This is an Africa, right? Ch rather than sh. One of them starts with a release. So ditch, and that becomes modern English ditch. But modern English also has the word dike, which is essentially the same word in origin. Both of them come from this form, which would have been something like dik in Proto-Germanic, and dike is borrowed back from Dutch because dikes are something that the Dutch are very good at building. So we have that word as well, and in fact the two words are two versions of the same word are cognate. And here's one that looks really weird, but works really nicely. G in these contexts is fronted to y. So, for instance, in Old English we have this word, and this initial sound is pronounced a y. So it's yeolwe, yeolwe, and that becomes modern English yellow. And this is actually cognate, believe it or not, with German gelb. The b corresponds to the OW at the end, and the g corresponds to a y. Believe it or not, that's a regular sound change. So we see a lot of words in English being affected by this palatalization. Later words from Norse aren't affected because by this time the sound change has already stopped. So we've seen this word that we borrow from Dutch into English is not affected. These words, basic words that are borrowed into English from Norse, are also not affected. So these are borrowed during the Middle English period, after the Old English period is finished, and then we get things like skirt and egg. And the interesting thing is, skirt is entirely cognate. It's related to the English word shirt, right? So skirt and a shirt, both of them originally referring to an item of clothing. Shirt is the original Old English form of the word, which underwent palatalization. Skirt is the new form that was borrowed in from Old Norse, but because it was referring to a different thing, it was borrowed in this context and specifically kept its k. Right? So then you get the distinction between a skirt and a shirt in present-day English. Another word that's related here is egg. The word egg in Old English develops into a, which again is a bit like German I, okay? It has a y at the end. But this word is borrowed into Old English, and the word that ends up winning into Middle English from Norse, the word egg comes from Norse, and it comes into the language and is pronounced with a g, and therefore, after that, it's retained with this g, and that is the form that ends up winning out. So palatalization affects Old English words. Words that are borrowed later aren't affected by it. Now, palatalization, again, is a change that happens in lots of other languages. So it happened in the history of German, too. In Old High German, or in pre-Old High German, the word Schiff would have been something like skiff. But the sk turned into a sh. The difference is that in Old English, this palatalization only happens when there are certain vowels around. In German, it happens all over the place. So the sk's all change into sh's. This palatalization process is something that a lot of languages have in common. Remember then that West Saxon Old English, the kind of Old English that we're talking about mainly on this course, has palatalization, even though it doesn't look like it does. So this is tricky. If you see words like this, ship, ditch, yelwa, the pronunciations are the palatalized ones, even though the writing system doesn't reflect it. Has anyone got any questions? Okay, we'll move on to breaking. Breaking is where certain vowels become diphthongs before certain consonants. Specifically, the consonants that are involved here are l or r, the liquids, when they are followed by a consonant themselves, or before certain other sounds, in particular h and w. H and w. So here, for instance, the E becomes an eo, or we've written eo, pronounced ew, and I haven't given you an example of that because in West Saxon, ew becomes eo. But this one is very widely attested. You will see these EO and EA spellings everywhere. And the E becomes EO, and the A becomes A. These we see in words like work, the word for work, werk, and the word for old, eld, or half, half. So these, we have diphthongal pronunciations to go with the two letters that spell them. This is a change that presumably took place in the 7th century. So almost all of the Old English that we have is affected by this change. And it particularly takes hold in West Saxon, which is why we see it so strongly in the texts that are preserved. What's interesting about this one is, unlike palatalization, we actually mostly don't see it in the language today. So old has it has a diphthong, but a different one. Half has a monophthong, so these changes, these breaking changes, end up being undone. So this is a feature particularly of West Saxon Old English that doesn't get reflected in the later history of the English language. But just so that you know what these things correspond to, because you'll see them all the time in texts. You'll see them in these specific environments, before an R followed by a consonant, or before an L followed by a consonant. Another one is self, which becomes seolf in West Saxon. And then finally, for sound change, we've got fronting. And here, back vowels or low vowels become fronted in a particular context, namely before E. In the following syllable specifically. So this leads to various interesting grammatical alternations. This is reflected in the spelling. So we see, I'm giving you modern English examples. In Old English, the word for mouse, in pre-Old English, the word for mouse would have been moose, and the plural, moosi. Right? But the E ending, it causes the vowel to umlaut. So then it becomes musi, and then the really tricky thing is that this E that triggered the sound change in the first place, once it's done its dirty work, it then scarpers. So then you lose this E entirely. And so that leaves you with alternations which are purely on the vowel of the main syllable of the word. So that's how you get, for instance, mouse versus mice in present-day English, right? Originally, these would have been something like moose and meese, right? House versus height. No, that doesn't work. It doesn't work with everything. Often these plurals get regularized out. So old plurals that used to have umlauts in them lose them. So for instance, cow, the plural of cow in earlier texts was keen, right? Cow versus keen. And in present day English, the plural of cow is simply cows, boringly. But this keen pronunciation for the plural of cows survives even into Shakespeare's English. So you see it even as late as early modern English. But if you ever wondered where these weird alternations come from, goose versus geese, this is where they come from. They come from this umlaut process. Again, the pre-Old English word for goose would have been gos, the plural would have been gosi, and this E then causes the O to mutate and become something like goosey. And then the I disappears, so you've got goose versus goose, which turns into goose versus geese. Sorry, there's a lot of vowels in a 5-second period there. Hope you got all of them. There'll be a test. There really will, I'm not joking. But like right at the end of the semester, so you don't need to worry about it now. Okay, so the I disappears, and this leads to a lot of the interesting plural alternations in English. So man versus men, for instance. Also other alternations, food versus feed. In particular, it often affects certain pairs of, let's say, noun plus verbs or adjective plus verbs. So for instance, if you look at alternations like blood versus bleed, again, this would have been at some earlier period blod and blade. And it's like that because these causative verbs used to have E in the suffix. We'll see this when we talk about the morphology. Blodian, Bledian. So Blodian would have become Bledian through the umlaut process, because the E would trigger a change in the vowel. Whole versus heel. These don't look like related words in modern English, but they are. They're related by exactly the same process as blood and bleed. Drank and drench is a particularly interesting example, because we can see there's not only a vowel change, a to e, but also this consonant has changed. And that reflects what? Palatalization, I hear you cry. We talked about it like 10 seconds ago. Seriously, guys. Palatalization. We've got a k that becomes a ch, right? And so this drank versus drench is a pair that is created by both palatalization and I umlaut operating at the same time to the same word. And again, this E in the suffix then disappears. So this E is a real, it does other things as well, but we won't go into all of them. It's a real sort of, sort of naughty perpetrator. It goes around causing phonological changes and then it buggers off. I umlaut, very prevalent in English. We see it already. We see it in the writing system of Old English, unlike, for instance, palatalization. And other languages also have the same process. In fact, all of the West Germanic languages have some variant of I umlaut, but they have it under different conditions. So alternations like ganz versus Gänse in modern German, produced by ultimately exactly the same process. At some point in the far distant history of German, there would have been an E in the following syllable. Okay, so let's see some examples now. I'm going to go back to the Cadman's hymn that we saw right at the start, or rather that we heard right at the start. Here you can see, first of all, obviously no great vowel shift. These things, this is not a nu or anything like that. It is a nu. Here, this is the word for heaven, Heavenreich. Now this letter f is pronounced as a v, and you can see why, because as I said earlier on, it's between two voiced sounds, specifically between two vowels. Vowels are basically always voiced, at least in Old English. So this is pronounced as a v, not a f. So this is heavon, heaven. And that's been maintained into the modern language. We can see breaking as well. Down here, this is the word earth, right? But it's earth. It's got this A, E and the O together. Now, this combination of sounds, or this combination of letters at least, the E and the O, may be most familiar to you if you're familiar with the Kingdom of Rohan in Lord of the Rings. You've got Eomer and Theoden. These guys, that's not a coincidence. They have names that are like that because Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, was an Old English scholar himself. And he took a lot of inspiration from the Old English language. There's way more interesting stuff to be said about that. But unfortunately, I'm short of time, so I'm going to talk about the boring morphological parts that you have to know instead. But you can go and read about Tolkien and Old English if you want, because it really is fascinating. The final thing to mention about Cadman's hymn is the alliteration. And you can see this all over the poem. Here in particular, you've got the stressed syllables, all begin with a w. So, werk, wolderfarer, swahe wundra. And then down here, you've got heovon tochrova, halich. So, h. Up here, you've got w. Down here, Vierumfalden freer almichtig, f. This is the basic structure of Old English poetry. It's not based on rhyme, it's based on alliteration. It's based on the first letter of the word, matching across the poems. There's actually a phonological reason for why it's like that, and that's because Old English has initial stress, and in a language with initial stress, alliteration works a lot better than rhyme. So it's to do with the phonological patterns of the language that the poetry works in this way. But if you look at Old English poetry, or the earliest Germanic poetry in general, you find this alliterative pattern, where the sounds match. Methodes michte. Okay? So, any questions about the sounds? Yes?
With the I umlaut, is that the same process related to the verb pairs in German and English? Setzen, sitzen, set, sit.
Yes.
Legen, lie, lay.
Yeah, exactly. So, for instance, sitzen and setzen, you can think of them as being related in the sense that one of them is to, or originally means something like to cause to sit, and the other one will be to sit, or to lie, or to cause to lie, i.e. lay. These are related in exactly that way, though you have to jump through a few hoops to figure out exactly why the vowels are the way they are. But yes, that's exactly the right development. Same in English, lie, lay, sit, set. Right. Any other questions? Right, we're going to move on now to the grammatical structure of Old English, which is going to keep us occupied for a little while. Because today we're going to talk about the morphology, and next week we'll come back and talk about the syntax. So the key thing to remember about Old English, and this is something that's been mentioned before, is that it's a relatively synthetic language. It has a bunch of cases, it has no obligatory subject or definite article, and it has flexible word order, not free word order. There are word order patterns in Old English. This stuff is stuff we're going to talk about next week. Now we're going to talk about the morphology of the language, but the important point is I don't want you to go around memorizing these paradigms that I'm going to show you, because there's a lot of them. What you need to be able to do is understand the general structure, understand how they work, why they work the way that they do, and be able to use these paradigms. So if you see a word, if you see a verb form, you need to be able to look it up, and that involves understanding its place in the paradigm. And there are various useful resources that you can use for Old English. So, for instance, this book by Hogg and Alcorn is an introductory textbook that you can get. It's nice and slim, and it contains just what you need to know in order to get familiar with Old English. Specifically, this book is almost the opposite. It's written by one of the same people, but it's a big fat book which contains everything you could possibly want to know. And if you're really, really feeling, perhaps it would be cruel to say, if you're suffering from insomnia, then you may wish to pick up a copy of this book and leaf through the many, many different variants of Old English morphological paradigms. And this one is similar. But there are many resources out there that you can use, depending on whether you want to look up something sort of fairly basic or something rather weird. There's something for all tastes with Old English. Okay, so here are some of the key features of Old English morphology and syntax in a basic presentation. So we've got first of all verb second word order. Then the kings gave, but it's then gave the kings. Right? You've got a plural ending here. This plural ending as. Right? This as ending is a distinctive. It's in Old English. It's distinctive to only a certain kind of noun, but this is where the s plural in English comes from. So the s plural, which now is used everywhere in English, comes from nouns like this, and this is the noun for king. And again, you can see here it looks a bit like German König, right? Then here you've got a dative demonstrative. Tham, and this, again, from a German perspective, it should look a lot like dem, right? And this, again, is something that is lost in present-day English. In present-day English, these case endings are not found. Here you've got an ending, an adjective ending, heilgan, heiligen, right? With this an ending, which is, in this case, a weak dative. We'll come back to some of these notions and explain what they mean, what weak means, what some of the cases are used for, and so on and so forth. But this is just to give you an idea of the general structure of the language. Another thing that you see, especially in this row, is an "e" ending. An "e" ending on dative nouns. This is a dative ending. This is the same ending that we find sometimes in German in phrases like zu Hause. The on house is a dative, an old dative ending. So these are just some of the features. And of course, modern English doesn't have endings on nouns for case. Modern English has plural endings and singular endings, but that's it. So all of this beautiful morphology that we find in the Old English period, some of which has parallels in German, almost all of it ends up being lost. And that is part of the transition, part and parcel of the transition from synthetic to analytic that we've been alluding to many times already. So if we focus first, we'll focus first on the nouns and adjectives and the noun-like things, and then we'll focus on the verbs. So looking first at the personal pronouns, the thing that should strike you at first is that there are loads of them, loads of different forms. And some of them are very rare. So Old English has something rather special. It has a dual. So wit and yit, this is palatalization. So remember, this is a y and not a g. This is not git. This is yit. Wit, yit, unk, ink, unker and inker, or unser and inser. These are lost. Even in the Old English texts, we find that these are rare and that you just get the normal plural instead. But what they mean, the dual form, wit means us two, means the two of us, me and one other person. Unk, similarly, yit means you, the two of you. It has to specifically refer to two people. And Old English has this. Other Germanic languages, all of them had it at one point. Gothic, we see it quite productively, but it has a tendency to be lost. As for the others, well, the main difference is from modern English is that we've got all these case forms. And the case system is the really big thing about Old English that you need to understand. So you have cases in Old English, and the cases have various functions. We're going to talk more about the functions next time. This time, we need to focus on the forms. But actually the forms, a lot of them are forms that you will recognize, and they do roughly the same thing. So ich, first of all, this is like modern German ich, right? Me or mech, which looks like mich. And then mein, mine, mine. And then here also he, him, his. Right? These things don't look so unusual because pronouns are the only thing left in English that have a real case inflection. So the pronouns do vary according to whether they're the subject or the object. The difference in Old English is that it's not just the pronouns that behave like that. Everything else behaves like that as well. So the adjectives, the demonstratives, and the nouns all have these endings depending on the grammatical function of the words in the sentence. There are some things that will look quite unfamiliar to you in this paradigm. One of them is probably this one, thu. This is the second person singular, right? This is like du in German. Often you find that words that begin with a th in Old English correspond to a d in German. So we saw tham, the demonstrative, which corresponds to dem. We see thu, which corresponds to du, and so on and so forth. So these words are basically du, dich, dir, and dein, right? And so they're used in the second person singular in Old English. They survive for a really, really long time. We find them in Old English, but they survive for an incredibly long time. In fact, there are some dialects of English today where people still use them. quite rare. I mean, but you do find it occasionally if you go to Yorkshire, especially if you go to a small village and talk to people who are very old. But this thu, you find it still, and it would be in early modern English we see it as thou. If you know the famous 10 Commandments, thou shalt not. That's the thou. That's the same thu, which is also du. Hopefully you're seeing the connections here. So this is what the personal pronouns look like. These, sometimes there's quite a lot of spelling variation. Down here you see here different forms for the third person plural genitive, essentially there. But we see hira, hiera, heora, hiora. These are interesting because the third person plural in English today, the third person plural is always formed with a the. They, them, their. In Old English what we see is he, him, hira, hiora. So where do these the forms come from? The short answer is that most people think that they come from Scandinavian. They're actually borrowings from Norse. And that's a pretty special thing. Languages are not all that well known for borrowing pronouns. Pronouns are usually something that's not that easy for languages to borrow from one another. But in this case, it does look like that's what's happened. At least that's the standard story. And there, again, Old English looks a bit different. And the other way it looks a bit different is you've got this ye form. These forms might look strange to you. Eo, 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 you. But they don't sound that dissimilar, actually, when you think about how they're really pronounced. Okay? So that's the personal pronouns. Does anyone have any questions about those? And here's some uses of these pronouns in context. So I've given you here, this is the fetch, dich pronoun, second person singular accusative. So this sentence means that death overpowers you. And here, we've got an interesting one. Then Adam hid hin. Literally, this in modern English, this would be translated as then Adam, literally as then Adam hid him. But what it means is Adam hid himself. And what that shows is that Old English doesn't have separate reflexive pronouns. It just uses normal pronouns where reflexives would be used. This is something, reflexives, proper reflexives, the forms that end in self, develop later. Here are the demonstratives. And the demonstratives are really useful because when you need to distinguish the case of some sort of noun phrase or a nominal phrase, you can use these demonstratives. They're the thing that varies the most. And again, you should be able to see some parallels here with modern German. So that is das, Thorne is den, Thas is des, Tham is dem. Modern English has just essentially bulldozed this. It's completely wiped all of it out. You just have the everywhere. But in Old English, you've got a huge variety, and the variety is entirely systematic. It's entirely dependent on the case. And the usual case suspects, nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative, will determine what form of the demonstrative you will see. So these distinguish the case of nominal phrases very clearly. And it's also worth pointing out that these demonstratives can function as definite articles. Old English doesn't have a definite article in the same sense that modern English has it. If you want to say the man, there are two ways of doing it. You can either say just man with a definite interpretation, so you can leave the article out. That's what part of what being a synthetic language is. Or you can say that man with a sort of weakened sense of the demonstrative. And that is what these words are for. So you can use these words effectively as definite articles in many contexts. Now, let's get on to the most interesting thing. The interesting thing is nouns themselves. And nouns themselves have grammatical gender. So nouns themselves, the gender of these nouns is determined simply by some sort of usually fairly arbitrary principle. So a boat is masculine in Old English. A ship is neuter in Old English. And light, shine, is feminine. There's nothing particularly masculine about a boat or neuter about a ship. These are not natural gender, right? They don't refer to any kind of biological sex or cultural gender or anything like that. These are just purely arbitrary categories that we use that give nouns different forms. And again, this is a property of German too, and it's a property of German that causes much annoyance to people who are trying to learn the language, like me. So, these are the forms that we get. You can see some generalizations across these paradigms. So, for instance, one thing that's very strong is that when you look at the bottom, all of these genders have an ending in the dative plural. So, it always means, basically, you can pretty much confidently say that when you get an ending on an Old English noun, it's dative plural. And that holds across the board. And if you find a dative plural noun, it will be In terms of the genitive plural, it has an a on the end. So that, again, is really systematic. In some other parts of the system, it's slightly more complicated. But for instance, look up here. You've got masculine and neuter singular genitives, bates, shippers. They're not all that different from the present day boats. For instance, the boat's engine, the ship's engine. This S. And again, this S is something that's only found in some nouns in the Old English period, but it spreads to a load of other nouns in the Middle English period and beyond. So S endings in the history of English have a remarkable tendency to survive where other endings fail. So these are what the nouns look like. These particular nouns get called strong nouns. They're strong nouns. That just means that they have a certain set of endings. It doesn't mean anything else. There's nothing strong about strong nouns. They just happen to have this set of endings. There are also weak nouns in a few minor classes, but today you should focus on just the strong nouns. And you can already see that the feminine has much less differentiation in its forms than all of the others. So these feminines are called rather misleadingly O stems, even though there isn't an O anywhere to be seen. These feminines you can see the accusative, the dative, and the genitive are all the same. And this is important to bear in mind when you think about Old English as a synthetic language, because Old English is a synthetic language, but it also isn't as synthetic as it could be. A real sort of rich synthetic language would have different forms for all of these different cells in the table. But actually Old English has a lot of what's called syncretism here. It has a lot of cells where the form is the same. The nominative and accusative are almost always the same in strong nouns. Okay? And the textbook has all these paradigms for reference. There's also a beautiful one-page PDF with all of the paradigms that you can download. Adjectives then, just briefly, adjectives work in Old English basically exactly the same as they do in modern German. So if you understand how modern German adjectives work, then you already understand how Old English adjectives work. It's just that some of the endings are different. Basically, the principle, again with adjectives, is that you have weak adjectives and you have strong adjectives. But in adjectives, the terms weak and strong mean something different. In adjectives, A strong adjective is one that occurs without a demonstrative, and a weak adjective is one that occurs with a demonstrative, and then they receive different forms. So here, for instance, these I've just given you the strong adjective endings, but the weak adjective endings, mostly they just end in an N, and they're a lot more straightforward. And again, you can find them in the book. Adjectives get their properties from context. And there's nothing, this is the adjective good, meaning good, that we talked about earlier on. And there's nothing specific about this adjective that means that it's masculine or feminine or neuter. Whether it's masculine or feminine or neuter depends on the noun that it occurs with. So if it occurs with a masculine noun like the noun for boat, then the adjective will be masculine itself. If it occurs with a feminine noun like shine, then the adjective will be feminine itself. Adjectives get their properties from context. That is the crucial thing about adjectives that distinguishes them from other parts of speech, other nouns in particular. And like adjectives in modern English, adjectives have different endings according to whether they are comparative or superlative. So here we've got different forms of the adjective hard. Hard, hardra, hardost. Hard, harder, hardest. Nothing complicated there. And here's a few examples. You can go through and look at these examples. I've annotated them. I've given you the grammatical details of these so that you can look at them and see what properties they have. You can look at these in your own time. I've also given you a few online resources that you can use. In particular, this one is beautiful. Here, you've got this one-page document which contains all of the morphology of Old English that you will ever need to know. In fact, much more than you will need to know for this course. So that's a handy resource. You can print it out and have it with you and sleep with it under your pillow and love it for the rest of your life because it is such a good companion. All right, any questions about the nouns before we move on? Or the adjectives, or the prepositions, or the pronouns, or the demonstratives? Yeah? No? All right, we don't have as much time for verbs as I'd have liked, but we can cover the crucial properties. So the crucial properties are that verbs are, and you can count the number of times I say this because I say it all the time, they're much more like modern German than they are like English of today. So we get endings on the verbs that depend on the tense, the person and number of the subject, and the mood. And on the whole, the system of endings works much the same way as it does in the present day language, except that there are more of them and they are more distinct from one another. In particular, you need to know about the subjunctive mood, which in Old English is used to express basically irrealis. Wishes or counterfactual situations. So here we've got an example. Ich will that du vergeten. I want you to forget. Here the ending is an ending. That's the subjunctive ending. If it was an indicative ending, that means that this is not a real situation. It's a hypothetical situation. It's something that you want to happen, but not something that has happened or is happening. If it was second person singular, we would expect an est ending. That du vergetest. And just like the nouns and just like the adjectives, verbs can be divided up into strong and weak. But again, pass auf, because the forms of the strong and weak in verbs mean something completely different again. And this is one of the beautiful things about the history of English. We have horrible terminology that we inherit from our forefathers. So, strong verbs are the verbs that change their stem vowels in the past tense and the past participle. Weak verbs, in fact, we've already come across. Weak verbs are the ones that form their past tense using a d ending. this special "d" ending that we saw was one of the defining characteristics of all Germanic languages, the dental preterite, the weak preterite. And one trend that we will see, though I won't illustrate it in detail today, is that throughout the history of English, many of the strong verbs become weak verbs. The opposite does occasionally occur, but it's much less common. So here are the strong verbs, and here are the endings that you can see. So this is the verb driven, to drive, which is cognate with the German verb treiben, right? Which means something different, but it's the same form with some changes applied to it. Here you can see all of the forms. So ich drive, du drivest. There's a st ending in the second person, and so on. Imperative, I've grayed most of it out because you only ever use the imperative in the second person, basically. So that's the only form you need to know. You also have this past participle, which can have a y on the front of it. Now, this, again, you have to be careful about because it looks like a g, right? And it functions in a similar way to the German g, right? But it's different because it's pronounced y, not g. It's also different because it doesn't have to be there. This y prefix is a little bit more playful than the German variety. It moves around. Sometimes you find it on other forms of the verb. Sometimes you find it on finite forms. Sometimes you find it on infinitives. So this y is something that you will often see, but you need to be a little bit careful about it. Don't conclude that just because you see a y, you're dealing with a past participle. It may be tempting, but it's not always correct. So these are the strong verbs, and the crucial property of the strong verb paradigm is that you have a vowel change. So here you see draf, right? Drive, draf. Drive, draf. And another thing that you can see here is something we talked about earlier on, which is that this F becomes voiced between voiced sounds. So drive, not drive. Those are the strong verbs. The weak verbs, the system is very similar. The endings are basically almost identical. The main difference is that in the past, you've got this d, this dental preterite ending. That is your key information for weak verbs. That is your smoking gun that tells you that a verb is weak. You see a d in the ending. And that's true in the past, in the finite forms, and in the past participle. Anyone have any questions about the weak verb system? And I'll leave this slide because there is the verb be in Old English, but just as it is in modern English, it's really weird and horrible. And so I'm just going to skip over it with the suggestion that you take a glance at it in your own time and discover its beautiful weirdness. Here's a nice little example. Unfortunately, I'm also not going to have enough time to go through. This is a text by famous Alfrich, who we talked about earlier on before. It's a little conversation between a teacher and a ploughman. And the ploughman is talking to the teacher. I've put it into a somewhat more contemporary format. This is not in the original. That is something that I've added in myself. Okay. But this illustrates some of these verb forms. So, for instance, what sagst du? Was sagst du? Right? This is so, some of these things are so beautiful. You know, we've got this ending here. Kannst du? Hast du? Right? And then here, ich habe. Ich habe. We've got all of these beautiful endings that illustrate what I've been talking about so far. The rich ending system of Old English. The verbs are much, much more specified for person and for number. And they agree with the subject of the sentence. Okay, so to wrap up then, we've got a bunch of sources for Old English. They're quite varied, but ultimately we have quite a lot of it. The problem is that it's quite homogeneous. It's mostly West Saxon. All of it is written by men. All of it is written by monks. So in that sense, we're quite limited in what we can conclude. Old English mostly uses the Roman alphabet. We've got 3 major sound changes that we've covered that it'll be important for you to know about: palatalization, breaking, and eye umlaut. And then we've ended by talking about the morphology, because Old English is a relatively synthetic language, and it has rich case morphology, particularly on nominal words. It also does have richer subject-verb agreement as well, though. Now, for the tutorial this week, you're going to get your hands dirty looking at some actual Old English text, and I've provided one online. It's this Genesis text which you can download in Ilias, text 1. What I want you to do is look at the words, look at the form of the words, look at the spelling, look at the endings in particular. As you've seen, the endings are really crucial. Try and draw parallels. Draw parallels with modern English. Draw parallels with modern German. Point out things that are different from both. And that is what I want you to do for next time when we will talk about Old English syntax, lexicon, and dialects. That's it.